Welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. If you're listening to this episode when it first released on December 27th, 2023, I wish you and yours a very Merry Christmas if you celebrate. For those of you who don't celebrate Christmas, I wish you a very happy holiday season. Finally, I know that the holiday season is not always cheerful and bright for everyone, and if that happens to be you, please accept this as my personal invitation to you to join our Discord server, where myself and many others will happily do our best to bring a bit of kindness and laughter into your day. Today's episode will be our last for 2023, but we're not taking a break over the holidays this year, and we'll have a new episode for you next week to kick off 2024 and season 4 of Call Your Hits, so stay tuned for that. Finally, before I dive into the episode, if you've been enjoying our content, please make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel as well and sharing our podcast and videos with your Airsoft friends. You can consider that your Christmas gift to me this year. Now, on with the show. Today, I wanted to talk to you about leadership in Airsoft. Over 8 years ago, we recorded a video talking about leadership in Airsoft, and in it, we focused on the core concepts of being an effective battlefield leader. Many of those ideas were taken straight out of, infantry manuals that we had access to at the time from the Canadian Forces, US Forces, and so on. And it focused on the type of Airsoft teams and squads where there's one team leader coming up with a strategic or tactical plan that all the team members are then going to execute, a typical battlefield leader that you think about. We talked about how the leader's role in Airsoft was more akin to that of a team leader in a real military team. And largely, this was because at the time, we really leaned into the military simulation aspect of Airsoft, MilSim. Since then, not only has our view of leadership in Airsoft shifted a bit, but how we actually leverage leadership on the Airsoft field has changed too. So today, I'm going to talk to you about what Airsoft leadership looks like for a large number of players and give you tips on how you can use leadership more effectively in your community, as well as on your own Airsoft team. Now, before getting into the specifics of team leadership, I want to quickly clarify what leadership actually is. At its core, leadership is being able to influence or guide others into taking a particular course of action. And you don't need to be a team leader, an officer, a boss, or even the best or most experienced player on the team to do this. Anytime you successfully influence people to do something in order to achieve a particular outcome, you're being a leader, whether or not you have the official role of a leader. It's not about shouting orders or even really telling anyone what to do. And in fact, some of the most successful leaders rarely have to tell anyone to do anything. The key word here is successful. Just because you're the team leader on paper does not mean that you're actually an effective leader. I mean, we frequently see this in Airsoft, and unfortunately, we've perpetrated this in the past, but you often will see players who bark orders at other players because that's how they think a leader ought to behave. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but for now, realize that if other players model their behavior, their equipment, or even their playstyle after what you do, they likely see you as a leader. And that is just as impactful, even maybe more so, than having your name in the team leader slot on a player roster. Largely speaking, you're going to find two broad types of leadership on the Airsoft field. Structured military-style chain of command leadership, typically reserved for MilSim and other larger events, and looser, ad hoc leadership that you'll frequently see at skirmishes and smaller games. Our old video really focused on this first category because at the time, I really saw myself as the squad leader. I wanted to come up with the strategies and tactics, and I wanted my team to execute on them. When you have one centralized command structure that is setting large objectives and relaying that information to a small set of players to then direct larger groups of players on the field, it makes sense to have one dedicated leader that people listen to. And in that context, the main advice from that old video still completely applies. That said, over the years of playing Airsoft and having spent some time, talking to airsofters from all around the world, I've come to realize that most of the leadership opportunities during regular day-to-day airsoft, so to speak, fall into the second category of leadership. For the vast majority of us hitting our weekly skirmish games, a structured military style of leadership is not just unnecessary, but it's almost impossible to implement when dealing with random people, renters, first timers, etc. What we see a lot more of, and have also talked about on the podcast before, is micro forms of leadership or ad hoc leadership, where a player influences another group of players to take some action together, whether it's grabbing a few beginners to make a push on the field, or quickly coming up with a plan before the start of a match. In some cases, especially in smaller communities like ours, you also might not be able to afford to take a less active role during the game. Your team might need every single player contributing as much as possible. So, how can you be a more effective leader during those types of regular games? How can you influence other random players so that your team can be more successful on the field? So, I want to look at 3 different situations and show you how you might leverage some different leadership skills in those situations. So, situation number 1. Imagine that you're getting ready to start a match. You don't have a team with you, there's just a random group of players, and you have an idea for a game plan that you think will be successful, but you need people to listen to you and go along with your plan. So, how can you facilitate that? Well, firstly, you need to make sure that most of the people in the group you're trying to influence, or at least several of them, know who you are. It's unlikely people will truly pay attention to someone they don't know at all. So take a second to introduce yourself and then tell the group that you have a plan you'd like to try if they're willing, right? So why would they listen to you if they have no idea who you are, right? It's like if you come up with a plan and you pitch it to them, it's like, why are we going to listen to you? So they need to know who you are. But the second part of that is to ask them, right? Tell them that you have a plan you'd like to try and ask them if they're willing. And if they're not willing, obviously you can't force it, right? Continue to try and work with that group, build a rapport with the other players, and then maybe later they might agree to trying your plan, right? If they actually do give you the space, explain briefly on what basis you have created this plan and why you think it might work. So, for example, you might say that you've played this field before and you've seen similar plans work out in the past, or that an opposing team used this effectively against you before. The idea here is to let people know that you've actually thought about this, right? To work through sort of the logic of your plan and that your logic is sound, right? That they can trust your opinion. Finally, outline what actions you will take and what you need others to do. And ideally, if your plan has a part that is a bit riskier, make sure you take on that risk yourself. And if there's a part that seems more cool or more fun, give that to somebody else to do, right? So be collaborative and ensure that the people you're playing with understand that you're not trying to make yourself look cool or have all the fun or anything like that. You just have a plan that you think will work, and you need help to execute on it. At this point, if everyone agrees with the plan, you can pat yourself on the back as you will have successfully influenced them to follow a set plan. That is leadership. And this is at a very basic level. What's going to happen naturally is the more you play at a field and the more people get to know you and they get familiar with your previous achievements, the less time you're going to need to spend convincing them to listen to you. But at the start, this is an essential step because just showing up looking like you know, looking like you have experience, looking cool, etc., doesn't mean anything. People need to know who you are and why they should listen to you. So that's situation 1. Imagine now situation 2. You are on the field and your team is getting bogged down by enemy fire and you're not making any forward progress. You need some players to start coordinating and make a break on one of your flanks. What can you do to make that happen? Well, this is probably a fairly familiar situation for many of us. And a natural response in situations like that is to yell at other players to make a move. But fundamentally, that's likely not going to be effective. I'm sure we've all seen this before, where you're in a piece of cover and someone is yelling at you, hey, I need you to do this, I need you to do that. The reality is that for most of us, if we felt like we could have moved, we probably already would have. So the players that you're looking at on the field, you can assume that if they felt like they could have moved or they could have put fire down or whatever, they likely would already have done so. What you need is some quick coordination. And the way to get that is to lead those nearby players. So if you have players nearby you, you can say to them very quickly, hey, we got to break out of here. I'm going to move to that piece of cover. Can you give me covering fire? Shoot a burst on full auto and I'll run. And then when I get there, you run to me. Something like that. Obviously, you want to keep this as clear and concise as possible. You can use more words or less words depending on the situation. And also, the players don't have to say yes. But in situations like these where people feel like they're not making any progress, they feel like their back is to the wall, most of them are looking for a lifeline and you're offering to stick your neck out for them. So it's quite likely that they will go along with your plan. The great part about this approach too is that you're not only leading by example, but if this works well, you'll actually have created a precedent with those players, and they likely will be happy to continue working with you in the immediate future. One thing you want to avoid in situations like this, though, is simply telling players to follow you. We've seen this happen a lot. I've done this myself, where an experienced player runs up to some less experienced players and says, okay, guys, follow me. Where are we going? What are we doing? What do you need me to do? I've had this exact thing happen to me before when I needed my teammate to throw a grenade around a piece of cover that I couldn't see around. So I gave my grenade to him saying, use this. And then I came out of cover expecting that the grenade would zip out at the same time, except he never threw it because he had no idea what he was supposed to do with this. So this is especially important when you're dealing with other random airsofters and especially with beginners. They might not know what they're supposed to do, let alone how to achieve it. You need to spell it out for them. And when it comes to shouting and barking commands at people, this appears to work in TV and movies because the people being yelled at have some sort of underlying knowledge of what they're supposed to do in the situation. They've just frozen. They need to snap out of it. They need to focus on the objective, focus on the mission, whatever it is. But if the player you're yelling at to provide suppressing fire doesn't know what suppressing fire is, or if you tell a player to break contact, but they don't know what breaking contact means, shouting at them to do that isn't going to make it happen. You need to explain to them what you need them to do and how. We've used this exact form of leadership very effectively over the years with many different kinds of players, from beginners to randoms to more experienced players. If your plan works, you make sure to celebrate and congratulate the players who helped you. And if it fails, well, you commiserate with those players with a quick, hey, nothing for it, lads, we'll get them next time, or a quick laugh about how much of an epic fail it was. The key is to not take yourself too seriously and make sure people see that you're enjoying yourself and having fun, regardless of what's happening on the field. You want to be approachable, you want to be personable. Don't be standoffish, and you'll find people are much more likely to respond to you positively. Nobody likes a tryhard who thinks he's a BB SEAL, especially at a casual skirmish game. So that's situation 2. Now on to situation 3. Imagine you've shown up to the game with 2 of your teammates and you're used to playing together, but you don't have enough people to make up a whole squad. And so it would be better if other players joined with you. How do you get them to do that? Well, this is similar to scenario 1 in some respect. Ask yourself, why should anyone want to join you? Do they know you or your teammates or how you play? It's always good to make sure you introduce yourself to others, and this is especially important in situations where the other players might be intimidated by how serious or professional you and your teammates are. Generally speaking, it's pretty uncommon for a random person to go and try to introduce themselves out of the blue to a group that seems to already be bonded. So in this case, you really need to be the ones to be outgoing. Once you've introduced yourself, you need to explain to the other players what you're planning on doing. So what's the play, what's your strategy, etc. And then ask if anyone would like to join you. This gives the other players a chance to think about whether or not what you're offering aligns with the kind of airsoft they want to play. And if not, don't force it, no big deal. But chances are you will have some takers. And because you all agreed to work together, it's much more likely to be an effective pairing. Again, in all three of these situations, remember that you are not actually anyone's boss because you're a leader. People signed up to play Airsoft, not to be led or bossed around by some random person they barely know. Almost all of the leadership skills you will use in this context will start by getting an agreement from everyone to actually work together, and influencing others will occur through asking, not telling players what to do. Now, I want to talk a bit more about formal team leadership for those of you who are on more structured teams. Maybe you are your team's leader, or you're trying to establish a leadership structure on your team, and you'll be playing together frequently as a group with the same people. Our video so many years ago was really angled at those players. And as I mentioned in the introduction, the content was taken straight out of real world small infantry tactics manuals. Since that time, and in particular over the last 5 years or so, our perspective on team leadership has shifted. Whereas years ago, we were really focused on one player, most of the time me, being the team leader, coming up with a strategy, and everyone executing that plan. Now we tend to take a much more collaborative approach. To be clear, it's not as though I was the only one who ever came up with strategies, but most of the time, players would typically ask me, okay, what's the plan, Phil? I would always solicit my team's opinions and ideas, but the final call was typically mine, and that's what we tried to execute on. The challenge with this model is that, unlike at a larger milsim style event where the team leader would have access to special information from higher up the food chain, and they would understand the squad's role in the larger effort of the game, during a skirmish, this isn't the case. I never had any special information, and in fact, once the game started, I often had less information than the players who were carrying out the plan on the field. So, sure, organizing and running your team like this at random skirmishes can be excellent practice and a great way to get reps in on more formalized teamwork, but it's absolutely not necessary, and it borders on overkill in many situations. Fundamentally, leadership is a tool just like any other, and it is more or less applicable depending on the job that needs doing. This is something we've gradually discovered at our local field, and now we have a much looser model where our teammates are all empowered to make tactical calls as the situation dictates based on the information they have at any given time. We rarely play games where big S strategy is necessary. Most of the game we play nowadays lasts 30 minutes to an hour tops. And as such, we rely a lot more on individual and small unit tactics than a traditional squad leadership model that looks at piece coordination, battlefield shaping, commander's intent, etc., etc., etc. What we have essentially created is a group where who the leader is changes moment to moment in response to what's happening on the field. We all know what we're there to achieve in the game, and since we're all self motivated in our minds to succeed, it makes the most sense that whoever has the best plan in any given moment should lead the team to try and make that happen. In practice, this can look like me being in cover, guarding our left flank, when John calls and says, "Hey, Phil, bound to me, we're moving." And I don't even question it. He clearly has a plan, he needs me, so let's go. On the flip side, it can look like me looking at Chris and saying, "Hold here for 1 minute," and running off to tag an enemy player before quickly returning. Chris didn't ask me where I was going or why I needed him to hold. He just did it. I did my thing and I came right back. We executed on the plan. Obviously, a huge part of why this is successful for us is because we've been playing together for well over 10 years and we know each other well and trust each other implicitly. And while that does play a big part, it's not something unique. Any team out there can recreate this by playing with each other, taking time to debrief after games to talk through what went well, what could have been better, what you were all thinking during the game, and overall just creating an esprit de corps, a bond between teammates. At the end of the day, if you're looking at creating a leadership structure for your team, my advice is both to keep it simple and don't assign a formalized leader role to anyone. Take turns leading, understanding how to apply strategy and tactics, making calls on the field, making mistakes, and learning from one another. In my opinion, this will serve you a lot better in the long run. And if I had my time back, I would have started doing this much sooner. It's obviously worth repeating that this works well at our local games in our situation. So if you're trying to apply a similar approach in larger events where big S strategy is a factor, structured leadership is important, etc., you will likely have different results and your mileage may vary. So, hopefully, this overview of leadership has been helpful to you and will help guide your thinking about leadership in your airsoft seasons to come. That's it for Call Your Hits in 2023, and it's a wrap for season 3 of Call Your Hits. It's pretty hard to believe that we've been doing these episodes for 3 years already, but there it is. Thank you so much for listening. It really does mean a lot. Your engagement on our content is tremendous, and we wouldn't be doing this without you. So thank you so much for listening. As I mentioned at the start, we will have another episode of this next week to kick off Call Your Hits season 4, the first episode of 2024. We'll see you there. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.